Alrighty guys, we're back again with another video today. Today I come to talk about Covenant-specific buffs in dungeons and how I'm really feeling about them as a whole. I'm sure it comes as no surprise that anything Covenant related is a fairly hot topic right now, but I wanted to talk about the pros and the cons to Covenant-specific buffs in dungeons and what reasonably can be done about it. I do think that there are at least some pros to having Covenant-specific buffs in dungeons, but I think how they're currently implemented, it is not good. Basically, just like the long and short of it is that I feel like the Covenant-specific buffs are too impactful for like groups that are lacking that Covenant, and it creates a pretty big mismatch in terms of balance in the dungeon as a whole, because do you balance around the assumption that people have the buffs? Do you balance around the assumption that people don't have the buffs? Like, where is really the tuning point in that equation of what you were giving people in relationship to the timer? So for those who have not seen, basically, whenever you have selected your Covenant, there are two dungeons in your respective region. Like Kyrian has Spires of Ascension and Necrotic Wake, Night Fae has Mist of Tyranid Scythe, and the other side, Necrolord has Theater of Pain and Plaguefall, Venthyr has Halls of Atonement and Sanguine Depths. That's basically how it ends up working out. And then all of them have corresponding buffs with those dungeons and like actions that you have to do to be able to gain a buff. So for Plaguefall, you have to flesh craft a corpse, like on top of the corpse of any of the slimes, and then you steal like a passive effect, and it gives it to your group for 3 minutes. And it really just kind of depends on what it is. So basically, the slimes that drop the haste, which is this rapid infection that spawn in Dr. Ickis's room, give you a haste, and it gives you a 25% haste buff. Great. Like, and the reason that I say great, and I say it in like a condescending manner, is because it's like too impactful. And then it's like, whenever you think about things like that, it's in Dr. Ickis's room. Are you going to tune Dr. Ickis around the assumption that these slimes are going to have are going to be present, and like, do you need the damage to be able to burn Dr. Ickis under the assumption that you're going to be having this huge ass haste buff? Or are you going to tune him under the assumption that he's just going to get blown up by the haste buff and not be an impactful mob at all? Because like, there's no great way to slice it, right? And unfortunately, it's just going to be like that, where there's just like no great way to tune it, because you can't make the assumption that you're going to have all access to all 4 covenants for every single dungeon. So whenever people make an argument in favor of this, they say that it's going to increase diversity in their dungeons. I actually give the alternative opinion, where I think it's actually going to decrease diversity in dungeons and decrease the ability to be able to choose who you're playing with a lot of times, even more so than is currently limited right now. It just really dilutes the concept of bring the player, not the class. Because right now, whenever you're selecting a person for Mythic Plus, things you have to look at that are not player specific are like Raider IO score. You have to look at what class they're playing. And now you're adding another wrench into that equation, which is covenants. So just giving like a meme example, whenever you're looking at LFG, it currently, right now in the game, it will be like looking for Demon Hunter Rogue, 2.5k IO. That's all it'll say. It'll be like looking for Rogue, 2.5k plus IO. Now, in the currently Shadowlands format, it'll be like looking for Rogue or Demon Hunter, 2.5k IO, and Necrolord. And you're like, but like, this doesn't make any sense. And there's always going to be trickle down effects somehow, right? People are always going to pick up just random meta bullshit, even if they don't need it or not, in the weekly. For the weekly 15. That's how it always is going to be. They're gonna randomly try to run a meta comp in a weekly 15 because that's all they know, and they see that the other top streamers are running this comp, so they believe that this comp is going to be the most well-rounded. I mean, it may or may not be. It just really depends. But they don't need it for their weekly 15. Was more my point, and they're going to be getting it anyways. But like, that's a different problem. But the fact that community-driven stuff like that just gives another way to be able to discriminate against other players, and that I think in of itself is going to reduce your ability. So say you are playing this Ret Paladin, which is supposed to be Kyrian. Like, Ret looks like it's going to be Kyrian. Say you don't want to play Kyrian as a Ret Paladin. Say in fact you wanted to play something else. Somebody sees you queue up into Group Finder and they're like, oh shit, we're going into Necrotic Wake that's a Ret Paladin. He's probably Kyrian. You get invited. You're fucking Venthyr. And the group is like, why aren't you Kyrian? Do you not take this dungeon seriously? Do you not take Mythic Plus seriously? Like, do you not take this game seriously? Why would I want you in my group if you don't take this game as seriously as I do? Because I picked the correct Covenant choice that all the other streamers and top players are saying is the best. And blah, 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 blah. And then you get kicked. And you're just like, maybe I should have been a Kyrian because I guess that was their expectation. But, like, and that's what Ian talked about is that, and Ian talked about in his Preach interview that he didn't want players to ever be removed from groups or feel like they had to be a specific Covenant for a group.
And if you're not, that actually, like, I know a lot of the anxiety that players have outside of the, cutting edge or the people who personally hate the idea of being, only 99% of optimal, of not getting the orange parse or, the gold parse. The anxiety people have is the imagined just fear that one day they're going to apply for a group, get asked what their Covenant is, they're going to say Venthyr or Kyrian, and get declined and told no thanks because you picked wrong.
But then they go in and add shit like this in dungeons where you are going to have all 4 Covenants selected if you want to be able to do keys at the highest level. Sure, there is probably a couple levels away from cutting edge where it doesn't really matter, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be a trickle-down effect in WoW, and whether or not you actually believe it matters, it's going to affect you somehow, some way. So taking just a little bit of a wide-angle look at this, there is an argument to be made that this could be easily solved if you make Covenant swappable. I do think that making Covenant swappable would fix this problem. However, also making Covenant swappable is really annoying. Making Covenant swappable is, I think, the best of a lot of bad ways to be able to fix the Covenant system, because it's actually giving the players opportunities, more specifically in these dungeon specific buffs. It's giving the players opportunities to be able to actually have a decision on whether or not they do have a Venthyr in Halls of Atonement, whether or not they do actually have a Necrolord in Plaguefall, whether or not they do actually have a Night Fae in the other side, because then you're making a strategy decision. You're deciding, oh, I really want this buff. Going Night Fae is least bad for whatever class, or going Kyrian is least bad for whatever class. You should swap real quick. We'll wait on you, and then we'll go slam this dungeon. And you know what? That's an interesting strategy decision. And that doesn't require... That is really annoying to have to redo a bunch of random stuff, and there's soulbinds and conduits and shit like that I'm not exactly sure the logistics of how swapping would be. But if they are intent on keeping the system, I think making Covenant swappable would be the best solution of keeping the system and making sure that it is going to be okay. The alternative of the system is something similar to what they do already in the game with the Bwansamdi Nazoth fish buff. So for those who don't do keys below a 9, or haven't done keys below 9 on this patch, basically the Bwansamdi buff is back, where it gives you a 25% damage buff, and it resets the cooldown on your Bloodlust. But it's only active for keys below the level 10. Basically, no seasonal fixes. I think that these are a good candidate to be active only in keys below level 10 or whatever, because they're too polarizing for higher level stuff. Even relevant levels of content, like the weekly 10s and other shit. I think that they end up becoming too polarizing for that level of content, and ultimately they just end up being annoying. There are some of these that are actually not that bad. It just, whenever we're talking specifically about the buffs, there's some that are not that bad. So if we take a look at the other side, the Night Fae ability from the other side is really pretty loose in terms of what you would actually be getting out of that. Basically, you click an urn and you are able to... I can't figure out how to get to the other side from here. Basically, you click an urn and the urn explodes after a short period of time. It stuns all targets around it for 10 seconds. That's honestly totally acceptable. However, the other Night Fae dungeon is basically... It has created a mandatory buff in the Night Fae, because you see right here, there are these mushrooms. And there are 2 types of mushrooms. Basically, you are able to get main stat by 10% for 10 minutes, or you're able to get stamina for 10%. Basically, you're going to pick the main stat every single time. In addition to that, it unlocks a checkpoint in the dungeon. There's no checkpoints aside from unlocking it via the Covenant there, the Covenant specific unlock, which honestly, I'm not happy with the buff as is, because I think the buff is so stupid. But then the checkpoint pushes it over the edge for me, and I'm like, what the hell is that? And I don't think personally, I don't think that they should be enabled in Mythic Plus at all. But if you really force me to compromise, I don't think that they I think that if they spent the development time on it, and I think that they and you said that they have to be enabled in dungeons, I think that I would push for them to not be enabled in what is deemed relevant content, i.e. 10 and up. Sure, I think that there is some added benefit of flavor there, and I think that if their covenants were swappable, I think it would add some interesting level of strategy to dungeons. However, as it currently stands, there's actually no strategy involved, and what I worry about myself is, right now, Moonkin looks like it's going to be Night Fae. You know what also looks like it's going to be Night Fae? Resto Druid looks like it's going to be Night Fae. Say Resto Druid's meta. Why the fuck would you take a Moonkin? It looks like Death Knight. Blood Death Knight looks bullshit on the beta right now. Blood Death Knight looks like it's also going to be Night Fae. Why would you bring a Moonkin? Also, Frost and Unholy Death Knight are both looking like they're going to be fucking meta, and they're looking really stupid on the beta right now. And you know what they're also going to be? Night Fae. They're all going to be Night Fae. And you know what that means for me, the lowly balanced druid, who's also fucking Night Fae? I don't get invited to a group because I don't have my Covenant-specific buff, or I just end up picking some bad shit because I want to play with my friends and want to actually be able to complete keys at a decent level because I feel like we're sandbagging by not having the buff. Sure, the buff is supposed to only feel additive into the dungeon, but whenever you watch other groups and they have the buff, then it just feels like it's detracting from your ability to be able to complete the run because you watch somebody else do it with the buff and you're like, oh, this is what the potential of the run actually is. But this is like but this is what we have, and you're going to end up losing a significant amount of time by not having the buff. Alternatively, they could just like give you the buff. Like I think the buffs in of themselves are fine, and like in M0s, they're not active unless you have a member of that specific covenant. But in Mythic Plus, they're just open the whole entire time, regardless. I think that would also be totally fine. I'm fine with these buffs. I don't think the buffs in of themselves are bad. I think how they're implemented and the gatekeeping behind covenants just tilts me off this fucking planet because I just see it, I watch it happen, and I'm like, man, this is just going to be a way for people to be able to prejudice against others in a way that's even further from bring the player, not the class. And exactly what Ian talked about, how people are going to get just ridiculed by not being the correct covenant choice and made fun of because they're gatekeeping power behind covenants as it currently stands. This system is so it makes me want to just it's so just stupid. And like, these buffs are cool. Like, the buffs that you gain in dungeons are kind of dope, and there's some interesting strategy behind them, especially with like the other side earn. The fact that that's a 10-second stun, but it's like hard to use well, like that is cool. You know what's not cool? The fact that you have to have a Night Fae in your group for it. You know what's not cool? With the Necrotic Wake robot that you end up activating, and it drops all these orbs on the ground. There's a cool level of strategy for who's picking up which of these animal orbs. Basically, the animal orbs get 4% movement speed, haste, healing done, and damage reduction for 40 seconds, and it stacks. These things last 12 seconds while they're on the ground. So determining who is going to pick up these animal orbs and what you're going to do with them is a cool level of strategy. You know what's not cool is having to have the Kyrian beforehand and having to know that you had the Kyrian beforehand in the group to be able to even activate the golem. That's not fun. Like, I think that any level in this game that reduces your ability to be able to play with your friends for whatever reason should be looked at with heavy scrutiny. And that's why I'm making a video today. That's why I'm upset. And I hope that this gets changed in one way or the other. I think that there are a lot of ways that they can change this to where it's going to be okay. Whether or not it be allow you to swap covenants, that's like an easy one. Whether or not it just disable the buffs in dungeons, that's also fine. Whether or not they always have the buffs enabled in dungeons, that's also fine. Or whether or not they have them disabled below or whether or not they have them disabled above a certain level. I think that also, they could just be non-impactful. Like, they literally could just be worthless and not worth picking up, but that's not fun. I actually want these buffs to be used in dungeons because there's like an interesting level of strategy behind, do you actually make your tank grab all 20 of these animal orbs for 80% damage reduction for 40 seconds and go massive? Or do you give it to your DPS and let him just kind of ascend on some mobs, doing the most fucking damage? And there's an interesting level of strategy involved in what you're actually deciding there. But as it currently stands, there's no real strategy involved because the strategy is determined outside of the dungeon whenever you're inviting people, and that's why it's annoying. Alright, that's going to be the end of the video. Hope you guys checked my stuff down in the description. I'm going to link, this article about Plaguefall from Wowhead as well. I hope to create some discussion. I've gotten differing opinions of this on Twitter, so if there are some differing opinions on it, I do want to hear what they are, because I fundamentally just don't understand like what the problem really would be with adding these into the dungeon. It's just I feel like they're not even a nice perk. Like I think that people are going to get ridiculed and prejudiced against, and they, for some, look on the surface like they should be a benefit, but they'll end up being a detriment. And that's how I feel about it. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.